Yeah, so what's been confirmed, the DOJ says that hundreds of millions of dollars were stolen through Minnesota programs that have already been charged. The biggest one to note is the Feeding Our Future pandemic meals case, which the DOJ has called the largest pandemic relief fraud scheme.
At 4:58 a.m., the courthouse lights were already on, an anomaly no one noticed until later. Minneapolis slept under a thin winter sky, while a single line moved through secure channels, stamped and time-locked. Authorized convergence. No public signals. There were no sirens, no alerts, no press staging. What changed instead were small things. Elevators that paused one extra beat, traffic lights that held red a fraction too long, access badges that refreshed twice before turning green. People felt it as friction, not fear. A city senses friction the way skin senses cold, before it understands why. 20 minutes later, 3 doors would open in 3 different places, and a story that had been hidden inside procedure would begin to surface. Not with accusations, with paperwork, not with spectacle, with timing. By sunrise, Minnesota would still look normal, but normal would be carrying weight it had never carried before. The operation unfolded as alignment. ICE enforcement teams and FBI financial units moved in parallel lanes, never crossing paths, never needing to. One lane handled presence, the other handled proof. The aim wasn't arrest first, it was context. Build the frame, then step into it. At a logistics park south of the river, agents entered offices that had perfected the art of neutrality. Frosted glass, generic signage, clean desks, servers warm, ledgers precise. Funds moved through shell entities with the confidence of money that expected to be audited and passed anyway. Analysts didn't rush, they let the system confess. Across town, a residential building with a view of the skyline received calm knocks delivered by people who already knew the answers. Verification proceeded quickly. Devices were bagged, documents cataloged. The work was administrative because the design had been administrative. The scale, 18 billion in misdirected assets over years, emerged not as a spike, but as a curve that never dipped. Then there was the courthouse. Not a raid, a review. Federal marshals coordinated access while investigators examined approvals that had always arrived on time and never asked questions. Case assignments aligned too neatly with outcomes. Motions denied without argument. Continuances granted like clockwork. A pattern that looked like efficiency until it was measured against everything else. Weapons existed as contingencies. Glock 19S holstered, AR-15 platform slung and untouched. But the leverage was never force. It was inevitability. The kind that arrives when every ledger agrees. By mid-morning, the name surfaced. Not shouted, not leaked, but referenced quietly in files that didn't need drama. A Somali-born federal judge, long praised for discipline and restraint, now connected by process rather than allegation. The exposure wasn't personal, it was structural. Decisions that had smoothed the way for a cartel's Minnesota footprint were now mapped end-to-end, approvals stitched to outcomes with timestamps that refused interpretation. Outside, Minneapolis adapted without knowing why. Coffee lines moved slower, meetings shifted, newsrooms sensed gravity without detail. Official statements stayed measured, confident in law, careful with verbs. By noon, the first transfers began. Not bodies, but assets. Accounts froze, properties flagged, vehicles logged. The city remained calm because calm had been designed into the plan. Minnesota didn't witness a takedown, it witnessed a reveal. One assembled from timing, paperwork, and the quiet realization that when process is captured, power doesn't shout, it signs. Phase 2 didn't start with doors, it started with numbers refusing to move. At 6:41 a.m., financial monitoring dashboards across 3 agencies refreshed at once and then stalled. Transfers that had cleared automatically for years were flagged mid-process. Escrow releases hung in pending status. Compliance alerts, long ignored because they never led anywhere, suddenly mattered. FBI financial units leaned in. Accounts tied to logistics firms, legal trusts, and property holding companies locked simultaneously, not as punishment, but as containment. The objective wasn't seizure yet. It was stillness. Let the system feel its own weight when motion stops. Across Minnesota, the effect traveled fast. A real estate office in St. Paul tried to close a routine transaction and found its wire delayed without explanation. A trucking contractor discovered payroll frozen just before distribution. A nonprofit shell attempted to reroute funds and triggered a second-level review that didn't exist yesterday. Each friction point was small. Together, they formed a wall. ICE field teams moved with the pause. At storage facilities and light industrial parks, units arrived as managers stared at phones that wouldn't update. Doors opened to calm questions delivered by people who already knew the answers. Devices were collected, credentials checked. The work stayed administrative because panic would have broken the illusion, and illusion was still useful. Attempts to adapt surfaced immediately. Backup accounts activated and froze. Intermediaries called contacts who no longer answered. The cartel's redundancy, its pride, betrayed it. Every workaround lit another indicator. Every detour confirmed the map. By mid-morning, the money trail was no longer a theory. It was a timeline. Funds that had flowed through Minnesota with judicial predictability now sat immobilized, their paths exposed. Approvals aligned too neatly with outcomes to dismiss. Motions that had cleared obstacles now read like permissions granted in advance. Weapons remained incidental. Glock 19 AU secured. AR-15 platforms slung and untouched. No one expected resistance. This phase wasn't about force. It was about letting the structure collapse under scrutiny. By the time assets began moving into custody, the city had already felt the shift. The cartel's power hadn't vanished. It had been paused everywhere at once. And in that pause, truth accelerated. Phase 3 converted stillness into motion, controlled, synchronized, irreversible. As the financial freeze propagated, ICE field teams and FBI case agents advanced along corridors that had been protected by predictability. Office suites opened early for compliance reviews. Storage units were accessed during narrow windows when logs aligned. Vehicles were checked at moments chosen for flow, not surprise. Every move assumed the network would try to adapt, and arrived where adaptation would hurt most. In a suburban office park, agents entered a law-adjacent consultancy that specialized in risk management. The desks were clean, the binders immaculate, the timestamps weren't. Case calendars aligned too perfectly with asset movements. Emails referenced approvals before filings existed. Servers were imaged while analysts watched patterns resolve in real time. Permissions granted upstream, outcomes delivered downstream, repeatable as clockwork. Across the river, a fleet yard stalled when gate systems failed in sequence. Trucks idled, dispatch screens went gray. Drivers waited for instructions that didn't come. The stop was calm. The effect was total. False partitions slid back to reveal cargo staged for handoff, balanced, labeled, and now irrelevant. The courthouse thread tightened. Investigators compared dockets against asset flows and found corridors where obstacles never appeared. Motions denied elsewhere sailed through here. Continuances landed on days that mattered. It wasn't favoritism, it was throughput. Decisions tuned to keep a pipeline open without drawing attention. The name surfaced again, quietly, as annotations in margins and approvals that matched outcomes too often to ignore. Attempts to reroute collapsed on contact. Backup shell entities activated and froze. Couriers tried to consolidate and triggered additional flags. The redundancy that once insulated the network now amplified exposure, each workaround confirming another segment of the map. Weapons surfaced only as background. Glock 19S secured. AR-15 platforms slung and untouched. Signals of readiness built for a different kind of day. This day belonged to paperwork moving faster than people. By afternoon, the corridors were gone. Not raided. Disconnected. The city kept moving above it all. Meetings rescheduled, traffic flowing. But beneath the routine, the cartel's Minnesota footprint had lost its pathways. What remained were fragments waiting to be processed. And processing had already begun. Phase 4 shifted the weight upward. With corridors collapsed and assets frozen, the operation moved into spaces that rarely feel pressure. Institutions that expect time to slow down around them. This phase wasn't loud, it was decisive. Federal marshals coordinated controlled access to offices that had never expected scrutiny at speed. Files were requested and produced without argument. Calendars were mirrored. Decision trees were reconstructed from approvals that had always seemed routine. The action unfolded in parallel. No single office felt targeted, but together they formed a pattern that could no longer be denied. Inside a downtown building, investigators reviewed years of case flow against financial outcomes. The alignment was exact. Delays appeared where resistance existed. Accelerations appeared where money needed air. The same signatures surfaced at the same junctions, never alone, always supported by process. Authority hadn't been abused openly, it had been optimized. ICE field units held steady while the proof assembled. At secondary sites, managers tried to buy time with compliance. Time wasn't available. Devices were cataloged, credentials verified, access revoked and restored only to log exits. The goal wasn't removal yet. It was containment. Keep everything exactly where it was while the picture finished forming. Attempts to influence the frame failed quietly. Calls were placed and not returned. Emails queued and never delivered. Intermediaries offered context that didn't survive timestamps. The system had learned its own language too well. Now that language testified against it. Weapons remained irrelevant. Glock 19S holstered. AR-15 platforms slung and untouched. This wasn't a confrontation between people. It was a confrontation between records, and records don't flinch. By evening, the internal map was complete. What had looked like isolated efficiency now read as coordination. What had passed for discretion now read as throughput. The exposure wasn't theatrical, it was structural, built from permissions that stacked into inevitability. Minnesota didn't watch authority fall. It watched authority explain itself and run out of explanations. Phase 5 was when the system tried to speak and discovered it couldn't. By nightfall, the Minnesota network had one option left: influence without visibility. Messages moved through intermediaries. Requests were phrased as favors. Context was offered to slow things down, to introduce ambiguity where the frame had become too clean. It didn't work. FBI coordination cells had already anticipated the pivot. Communication nodes were mapped not by content, but by timing. Who called whom after which approval? How long it took for decisions to echo outward. When the calls came, they arrived exactly where analysts expected them. Each attempt to intervene confirmed another linkage. ICE transport units began rotating in. Not mass removals, targeted extractions. Individuals whose roles connected permissions to outcomes were separated quietly and moved into secure processing. Offices closed early. Meetings were canceled with neutral explanations. The city barely noticed the personnel changes. The system felt them immediately. In a secure facility, timelines were overlaid one final time. Judicial actions, asset movements, logistics approvals. All of it aligned without gaps. The exposure didn't rely on testimony. It relied on repetition. A pattern so consistent it no longer needed interpretation. Attempts to delay collapsed on contact. Emergency filings stalled. Administrative reviews arrived too late to matter. The authority that once smoothed obstacles now faced a structure that answered only to sequence. The network's voice, its ability to ask for time, had been removed. Weapons remained background. Glock 19 ET secured. AR-15 platforms slung and untouched. This phase wasn't about confrontation. It was about silence, replacing leverage. By the time transfers expanded from assets to people, the outcome was already fixed. The work shifted from investigation to custody, from exposure to resolution. Minnesota didn't see the end arrive. It felt it as quiet, the kind that settles when nothing else can be said. The final phase arrived as confirmation. By morning, Minnesota had returned to routine. Commutes resumed, offices reopened, the city moving as if nothing had happened. The operation left no barricades, no spectacle. It left records, and records don't fade. Inside federal systems, the case resolved into permanence. Asset custody chains locked, properties flagged, trusts unraveled. The figure, $18 billion, stopped being a rumor and became an inventory, divided into accounts, parcels, vehicles, and instruments that would never reconnect the same way again. What made the ending decisive wasn't arrests alone, it was closure. Judicial actions once optimized for smooth outcomes were boxed into timelines that no longer bent. Orders were reread against results and annotated without drama. Authority didn't fall. It reverted to process that refused accommodation. ICE units rotated out quietly. FBI teams archived dashboards that no longer pulsed. Employers adjusted. Contractors rebid. The landscape shifted toward approvals that would take longer and mean exactly what they said. Public language stayed measured. Ongoing reviews, standard procedures, institutional integrity. No narrative, no escalation. The work had already moved past words. Minnesota didn't witness a spectacle. It witnessed resolution. The moment a system stops negotiating with evidence and starts obeying it. The network didn't disappear because it was chased, but because its permissions were revoked everywhere at once. When process returned, power didn't resist. It simply expired.